All right. So welcome everyone to the final webinar of our 2024 series for the Florida Society for Ethical Ecotourism. And this presentation is about corals in Florida. I'll be talking about the ecology of corals, threats to corals, and conservation. And my name is Carolyn Kovacs, and I am the Florida Sea Grant Extension Agent in Flagler and Volusia counties. So, for those of you who are maybe joining us for the first time, I want to let you all know about the Florida Society for Ethical Ecotourism. This is an organization that was established in 1998 to maintain a professional code of ecotourism and ethics in order to encourage awareness and stewardship of Florida's natural heritage. And so, this is something I think quite a few of you guys who are attending these are already members of Florida Sea. So, thank you all for being good stewards of the environment and putting in the work to make sure that you are providing a great experience for tourists in Florida and also helping protect the environment and share those important values with the visitors. But also, it is great for those of us who are tourists, whether that is people coming to Florida or also, I know a lot of us like to travel all around the state. And so, if you look on the floridasea.org website, you're able to find a list of these Florida Sea certified eco tour operators, and you know that you're going to be getting some very well-educated, knowledgeable, charismatic people who care a whole lot and are doing great work and are going to be good stewards of the environment. So definitely encourage you all to check that out. And I, again, am Carolyn Kovacs. I'm the Florida Sea Grant Extension Agent in Flagler and Volusia counties, and I am on the board for Florida Society for Ethical Ecotourism and also on the Education Committee, along with two other Florida Sea Grant Extension agents, Kate Rose, who is also on this meeting with us tonight. She's waiting. She is going to be monitoring the chat. So also, if you guys have any questions as we go, if you put those in there, she might be able to answer. Otherwise, at the end, we'll go through all of the questions, and I'm definitely happy to answer anything. And then also, we have Michael Sipos, who is another Florida Sea Grant Extension agent down in Collier County, who is part of our team. And with Florida Sea Grant, we are part of the University of Florida IFAS Extension Program. So we are the Sea Grant agents providing marine and coastal information and resources, as well as educational opportunities for adults, and sometimes also partnering with our 4-H, which is the youth development part of Extension. So I definitely encourage you to reach out to your local Sea Grant Extension and your Extension office as a whole if you haven't connected with those. And again, we are part of University of Florida IFAS Extension, so our programs are open to all people, and just want to share that information. So today, talking about corals, why should you all, why are you guys here? Why do you care about corals? I'll be talking about that a little bit more as we go on. But just first of all, I think probably everybody who's on here think that corals are just really fascinating and beautiful and create these beautiful reefs. And so we care about them for that reason. If you work in ecotourism, if you directly interact with corals, obviously you care, but even if you don't, people who are coming to Florida, they've heard of corals and coral reefs. So you might get questions about them, even if you're not in a coral area. So it's good to know some basic information. And also, unfortunately, in 2023, we had a really big bleaching event and it was in the news, attracting a lot of attention. And so I think it's important for us all to understand some of the basics about corals and about what is going on, and of course, what we can do to help out. So today I'll be talking about coral ecology, about the different species of corals that are found in Florida, the importance of corals, threats to corals, and what can we do to protect corals. So first of all, what is a coral? Animal, vegetable, or mineral. So corals, so first of all, a lot of times I do these presentations, I'm in person. I like to ask a lot of questions, but I know it's a little bit harder to do that here online. So I'm going to go ahead and give you guys the answer that it is an animal, right? So corals are invertebrates. They are a type of animal that does not have a backbone. And it's a little bit of a tricky situation though, because even though these are corals, these are animals, they have an algae that lives inside of them. I'll talk more about that shortly. And also they build their skeleton, which is made out of calcium carbonate. So they're creating something through a mineralization process. So they are an animal, but it's a little bit more complex than that. So again, I said they are a type of invertebrate. They belong to the phylum of Cnidaria, with nidos meaning the stinging cells. So these are all things that can potentially sting you. So they are related to, we've got jellyfish, and our box jellies and our fire corals are all in different classes. And then the class that our hard corals that we're going to be talking about belong to is Anthozoa. And this is then broken up into our soft corals and our hard corals. So our soft corals are octocoralia. So octo meaning eight. This has to do with the radial symmetry. So they have an eight-part radial symmetry. And these guys have a flexible skeleton. So you can see in the image here, we've got our sea fans on the right-hand side. On the left, we've got, or the center, we've got some sea rods. And on the left, we've got sea feathers, also sometimes called slimy sea plumes. And so these are all types of corals that sometimes we also call them flexible corals. They have a skeleton that is much more flexible. You can see even in the image on the right how there's waves coming over and those sea fans are going to move with the waves. Then our other subclass that we have is hexacoralia. So hexa meaning six. So we've got a six-part radial symmetry. And these include our stony corals or our hard reef building corals of what you typically think of when you think of coral and a coral reef. And it also includes anemones and zoanthids. So that bottom right-hand picture is of a type of zoanthid. So it almost looks like little small anemones that are all connected to each other. That's not building a hard reef structure. It might grow over top of them, some dead corals or other limestone. And then up in the top right, you see that anemone, which is going to be a larger single organism as opposed to our corals, which grow in colonies. So if you look at that image on the bottom left of, that large coral right there, you might think like, oh, that's, one coral. Well, it's one coral colony, but it's actually made up of hundreds of tiny individual coral animals, each of these little coral polyps. So corals, again, when you're looking at them, it's a colony. And so you see on the top right-hand side a close-up of one of those individual polyps. It almost looks like a tiny anemone, right? And they are able to reproduce asexually. That's how these corals are going to be growing. You can see their little tentacles. That's where they're going to sometimes be capturing food and bringing it into their stomach, which you can see that hole right there where they got their mouth. They're going to bring that in. And then they have their gastrovascular cavity, and then they've got the calcium carbonate structure that they are creating, they're building. And so all of these individual coral polyps are working together. They actually share some of their nutrients and resources, and they're going to be growing together in that large colony structure. Our corals also have a microscopic algae that lives inside of them. It's called a zooxanthellae. And so this zooxanthellae, it's if we want to be specific about the type of algae, it's a type of dinoflagellate, and it lives inside the coral and it photosynthesizes. And so it is using sunlight and the process of photosynthesis to create food, and that food then is what feeds the coral. So it depends on the species of coral, but in general, corals get about 90% of their food, of their energy from the products of those zooxanthellae. The other, about 10%, they're going to capture with their tentacles and be putting into their gastrovascular cavity. And so they very much rely on these zooxanthellae. They have what's called a symbiotic relationship where the coral is benefiting from getting food. And then the zooxanthellae gets a safe place to live. They are getting the byproducts of those coral animals, and they're able to use that for their photosynthesis process. And so that is something that's very important for coral survival and will come up again later. In looking at some images of our corals, I really this is one of my favorites. This is our great star coral, and I just think it's so interesting to look at the image on the left-hand side. The coral has its polyps open, and on the right-hand side, it's the same type of coral, but it has those polyps closed, and so you can see that those tentacles tucked in, tucked away. For the most part, our corals are going to have those tentacles tucked away during the day because they don't want to have little fish or anybody else coming around, feeding on them. And also, there's really no reason for them to have their tentacles open because they're not usually going to be feeding during the day because they're going to be relying on that zooxanthellae and the photosynthesis while there's sunlight. However, at night, that is when they typically will open up because no sunlight, no photosynthesis, they're not getting any food during that time. That's when they're going to open up and use their tentacles to capture some small prey items and continue feeding that way. And again, just another image of two different, the same species of coral, two different corals that were near each other. And on the left-hand side, again, you can see that the polyps are retracted, pulled inside the coral. On the right-hand side, they are extended out. And so corals can look pretty different depending on whether they have those corals extended or not. And this is a finger coral. Again, I think it's cool, even just like the coloration looks slightly different here. So our corals live worldwide in terms of, all the different countries, but you can see here that they are limited between about 30 degrees north and south of the equator. They don't like cold water. So corals are tropical, they are very picky. As we'll talk about later, they also don't like the water to be too hot, but they definitely don't like the water to be too cold. And so we do not find them in areas above or below about 30 degrees. However, if you're looking at this, you see all of these corals throughout Australia, throughout Indonesia, even around Africa, and of course the Caribbean. And then if you look at the same, latitude here, but over on the west coast of South America, you say, well, why wouldn't we have corals there? Everybody knows there's upwelling there. So that is a place where we have deep water that is coming up against the shelf and is coming up to the surface. And that deep water is cold water. Same thing, like around California, why California's coast has much colder water than we do here in Florida, or even if you went to like Virginia in the summertime. That deep upwelling. And so that is going to be preventing corals from living there because that water is going to be too chilly. So here in Florida, where we have corals, is also dictated by the water temperature, which is very much affected by our currents. And so we have what is known as the Gulf Stream, and we call that also close to Florida, the Florida current, and part of it is the loop current over in the Gulf of Mexico. And I love this image on the left-hand side that you can see the difference in the sea surface temperature. And so you can see where the Gulf Stream is that much warmer water. And as you go near Miami and South Florida, you have that warm water very close to shore. And then that goes up and then it eventually goes off to the right. So I live in Volusia County. I'm above Cape Canaveral a little bit. And you can see that we have cooler water closer to shore right there. And our water gets much chillier up here than it does in South Florida. In the wintertime, they have that Gulf Stream that is staying right close to shore. So even in the wintertime, they're having that warmer water right nearby. And this very much affects where we have our corals in the Florida Reef Tract. Of course, it's also going to be affected by the type of substrate that is available. Corals need something hard to attach to, so it has to do with that, as well as the depth, wave action, currents, a lot of other things, but primarily our temperature is what's affecting it here. And so you can see on the right-hand side, the Florida Reef Tract going through the Florida Keys, up through Miami-Dade, Broward, Palm Beach, and up to Martin. And that's about as far as the Florida Reef Tract goes. There are some corals, I'll mention, that can live above this, but that's for the most part where our corals are. We have about 350 miles of coral throughout this distance that I'm showing right here, and 2/3 of that is either in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary or in Biscayne National Park. And here in Florida, we have about 45 species of hard corals and 35 species of soft corals. And so I will talk a little bit, well, I've already talked about those. I'll show you some examples of a couple of those different species that we have in our area here just a moment. And it's believed that our reef that we have has been around for about 10,000 years, obviously changing over time, but it's been around for quite a while. So here, I just wanted to mention, again, I live up in Volusia County, so I'm a little bit further to the north, and we do have some artificial reefs, primarily ships that have been sunk for the purpose of artificial reefs. We also have our jetties nearby. So I know that these are found in our area, and I've heard from other folks, even up in Jacksonville, if you are able to see what's growing out on their jetties, you'd find some of these same species. So there is a type of hard coral, Oculina. You can see on the left-hand side two of the different Oculinas. And this is a coral that can live very deep. And it doesn't necessarily, it's not going to rely on its zooxanthellae for as much food. So remember I said about most corals, about 90% of their food they're getting from zooxanthellae. That's not the case for all of them. So these are deeper water corals. They can survive colder water. They can survive deeper with less light because they are going to be relying much more on their polyps for catching their food as opposed to zooxanthellae. So that bottom left, that coral is all white. Maybe if you guys already know, we usually associate white corals with coral bleaching, and it's not a good thing, but this coral is fine. It's how it is. And again, it's not relying on zooxanthellae for its food, it's relying on its polyps. And then over on the right-hand side are two examples of soft corals, a sea whip and another octocoral. And there are more species of these that can also, again, be living in colder water or in deeper water where they're not going to be getting sunlight. So there are some corals that can live outside of that Florida reef tract. Just want to mention these, but moving forward, the corals that I'm talking about are going to be corals that you find in the Florida reef tract, also throughout the Caribbean. Most of these images, not all, but most of them are ones that I have taken. And full disclosure, a lot of them were taken outside of Florida. I worked in the Caribbean and had opportunity to do some work with corals, but they are all species that would be found in our area as well. So I just want to talk through a couple of this main species. So if you all have the opportunity to go snorkeling in the Florida Keys or again elsewhere in the Caribbean or down near Miami or Palm Beach, these are some of the species of corals that you could hope to expect to see. The first is staghorn coral. You can see how it got its name. It's corals looking like the antlers of a stag right there. And this is one species of coral that unfortunately, if you're going to see it, it's probably because somebody has already done some coral restoration work. This species of coral was very much affected by disease, a type of disease called white band disease that affected corals in the 1970s. It wiped out about 97% of the staghorn, and also I'll show you up next the elkhorn coral throughout the Caribbean. So it really decimated the population then. Thankfully, that disease is not nearly as prevalent anymore, and so it has been able to recover in some areas from the disease. You can see we've got our staghorn coral, our Acropora cervicornis, and we've also got our elkhorn coral, Acropora palmata. So this one named as such because it looks more like the horns of an elk, so it is much broader, wider, flatter. But these are the two species of Acropora that we have here. If you go over to the Indo-Pacific, there are so many more different species of Acropora. There's a lot more species that exist in the Indo-Pacific. It's an older ocean. There's just been more species variation. So if you go over to the Indo-Pacific, there's more species of coral, more species of parrotfish, more species of mangrove. So they have a lot of the same types of things we have here in Florida and the Caribbean, but they have a lot more genetic variation. But again, we've got our elkhorn coral. These two have a similar color. You can see they've got sort of a orange, brown, yellow, palish color to them. And these are two of the species that have been used in coral restoration projects a lot, especially at the beginning. Corals grow very slowly. Some species of corals will grow, only like less than half an inch in a year, some of our boulder corals. And so it takes a very long time to reach a large coral. Yeah, again, just growing very slowly. However, your staghorn coral can typically grow about 6 inches a year, maybe even more in certain restoration projects. And so it was primarily used at the beginning, just again, ease of growth, how quickly it can grow, ease of handling. However, as we have been doing more restoration work, which I'll talk about more as we go on, there has been we've realized that we need to not just focus on this one species. We need to be focusing on having a wide range of corals because they have different functions in the ecosystem, and also some of those boulder corals have been surviving coral bleaching events a lot better than some of these Acropora species that they've been using. A few others, finger coral on the left-hand side. You can see it's kind of another branching coral, but it grows much lower. It's not going to branch out quite as much. And mustard hill coral. These both are belong to the genus Porites. And then a few others. One thing I love about corals, the common names, they all are named because of something that the corals look like, so they're relatively easy to remember. We've got our star coral. There's actually several species of star coral. You can see that the corallite, so the corallite, the structure of those individual coral polyps, has this beautiful star shape. We also have lettuce coral. Again, there's many species. Some of them grow more up and open, like if you had some iceberg lettuce. If you go down into deeper water, then those lettuce corals grow more out and flat because they want to be able to get more sunlight. If you're living in shallow water, you don't want need as much sunlight because that sun's going to hit you already, so your branches are more up. If you're deeper, branching is or plates are growing more out. And then on the right-hand side, we've got starlit coral, so much smaller, tiny corallites, tiny stars, and our boulder brain coral. Again, there's several different species of brain corals that we can find in our area. Boulder brain coral is the one that has the largest, pattern with that brain design. And then when we're looking at our octocoralia, or our soft corals, and our flexible corals, you can see here a very large sea fan, as well as some slimy sea plumes, which is a great name, sometimes also called sea feathers. I did also want to mention one more soft coral that is in our area, that is unfortunately in our area, or potentially. Hasn't been confirmed in the Florida Keys, but it has been spotted in Cuba and Puerto Rico, and it's a known invasive species in Venezuela. So this is a zenith coral. It is a type of soft coral that's originally from the Indo-Pacific, and it has made its way over to our side of the world. And unfortunately, it is able to outcompete some of our native species and will grow over some of the corals that we have here. So this is not a coral that we want in our area. It's not a reef building coral. It's one of those soft corals. So if you are a scuba diver and you see these corals while you're out on the reef, we are asking folks to report that, and I'll provide some information later on about how you can do that. So why are corals important? I talked about this a tiny bit at the beginning, but there are several different reasons why we care about corals, other than the fact, again, we'll just talk about the fact that they are beautiful, and I think we all just enjoy them for what they are. But in terms of ecosystem services, one thing is that they create habitat. So I love this image here because you can see how there's coral and therefore there are fish. Fish look out for structure. They want somewhere that they can hide. Small things will go there, and therefore bigger things will go there looking for their food. And so if you just have open ocean, you're really not going to have a great chance of running into fish. But if there is a coral reef there, if there's that structure, then you're going to be attracting all of the wildlife that lives in the water. With that, they just have a huge biodiversity. There is, for how much of the area of the ocean that corals cover, which is a very small percentage, they house about 25% of the biodiversity of the oceans. And so, we just have so many different species of fish, of corals, of invertebrates that are all living in that area. And with that, they also are important in supporting fisheries because they're creating that habitat. There's an area that fish are going to come together to spawn, to grow larger, and our corals are very important in supporting a lot of the fisheries in Florida, recreational and commercial. They also provide a huge shoreline protection. So you can see here, an image of on the very left-hand side is where we have those mangroves. You'd have the land further inland from that. And then we've got some seagrass, some smaller reef. You might have a channel, and then you have the land growing up where you have the main reef. And this reef is very important in serving as a breakwater, and it's going to absorb the wave energy so that you don't have a large amount of wave energy that's then hitting the land. This is going to help prevent erosion and protect that land. And then, of course, when we have storm events, we have hurricanes, that's really going to be important in absorbing some of that energy and decreasing the amount of impact that those waves and the hurricanes are having on shore. And finally, the tourism and the economy. Like I said, we think corals are beautiful, and most people do. And so many of the folks that come to Florida, especially people that are going down to the Florida Keys, all of the things that you do on the Florida Keys are on the water, right? Nobody goes down there just to stay on land. And so again, whether you're going out fishing or you're going out snorkeling or scuba diving, so much of that tourism is dependent upon the reef right there. And as a result of that, it's a huge part of our economy with over 71,000 jobs being related somehow to our coral reefs and the larger ecosystems and the hotels and everything related to that. But unfortunately, we have quite a few threats that are impacting our corals. So, some of those, the first thing is just our land-based sources of pollution. There's a lot of stuff going on land, and there's a lot of that that then will wash into the water as a result of human activities. So we have excess nutrients, and whether that's coming from fertilizers that's being put on lawns and on landscaping, or whether that is fertilizer that is being put on agricultural lands, or whether that is nutrients that is leaching into the water via septic systems that are either not maintained properly or just areas where we have too high of a density of septic systems for what the area can handle. All of those are bringing nutrients into the system, and as they're bringing nutrients into the system, that is going to feed algae. Corals live, corals are very effective. They don't need many nutrients. They have those zooxanthellae that live in them, and those zooxanthellae are a type of algae. They do need a little bit of nutrients, but they get most of that from the corals. So they're very efficient systems. If you think of where you see coral reefs, it's always where there's beautiful, clear water. And that's because they live in areas where they don't need a lot of nutrients. So if we are adding excess nutrients to the system, now now algae are able to thrive and bloom, and that is going to end up potentially um, making our water less clear, which is then going to not allow the corals to get the sunlight that they need for those zooxanthellae. Or it also could end up just having literal smothering. You can see on the image on the right-hand side, that is that's a macroalgae. That's an algae that's physically attached to and now growing over sections of corals. Other things that could wash in from shore include sediment. So if we are removing native vegetation and there is more runoff of sediment, that can also make the water cloudier and also can literally smother the corals again. We can also end up having pathogens and other toxins and pollutants wash into the system as well. And that has actually been linked to some of the diseases that corals have ended up exhibiting. So a lot of these land-based sources of pollution, they can interact, but the main issues again are that they lead to algae growth and smothering, decreased light, and also some of our disease. Some of the coral diseases, again, they're named by what they look like. Black band disease, you can see that there is a band of black that is moving through, and the healthy coral on the bottom, and then above where that black band is where the coral has been affected by the disease and the animal part of the coral has died, leaving just the skeleton behind. On the right-hand side, you see white band or white pox disease. Again, that's the one that's affecting our elkhorn and our staghorn corals. So some diseases only affect certain species of corals. They don't affect all. Some of them can maybe only affect a couple, like white band disease, just affecting acropora corals, and others can affect a large range of corals. And unfortunately, that's what's happened with a relatively new, not so new quite right now, stony coral tissue loss disease, or sometimes called skittle. First reported in 2014, and this was first reported outside of the Miami area. So this originated in Florida and has spread um, throughout Florida. So here you can see the red showing where the corals have been observed. So 2014 when it first started, and then as the years continue, it moving up and down and has now been observed everywhere within Florida that we have coral reefs. And this is a disease that has been affecting 35 different species of coral. So if you remember, we only have about 45 species of hard corals, and affected 34 of them so far. So when it is affecting the coral, it moves through quite rapidly. On this bottom image, you can see the dates going from just January 5th to the 19th to February 1st, and how rapidly that disease is moving through the corals. Here you can see the website from AGRA, the Atlantic and Gulf Rapid Reef Assessment. They've been the ones who've been monitoring stony coral tissue loss throughout the entire Caribbean, including Florida. And so this is actually data that's been collected from people who've gone scuba diving and have submitted the data. So again, if this is something that you're ever traveling and you're scuba diving, you can contribute to as well. And so all of the red dots indicate places where there have been surveys that they have observed stony coral tissue loss, whereas the green are places where they didn't. I believe the purple was some uncertainty at the time. And this disease has now spread. Oh, I don't have it there, has now spread to 33 different countries throughout the Caribbean and more recently getting its way around to Mexico, Belize, and those islands off of Nicaragua right there. This disease, um, they've been trying to figure out as much as they can about it, but you can see here again, we've got, you know, as corals die, you have the disease moving through. If you are just going out and you see a coral and you see a coral is dead, it's hard to know what exactly has happened to it because, as you can see on the bottom part right there, once the coral is dead, it starts to just be covered in algae. So if you aren't going out and actively monitoring reefs and you just see a dead coral that's covered in algae, it might be difficult to know what has actually caused it. But if people are out on the reef often enough and they're able to see these changes and see what's going on, that combined with knowledge of what's going on in the area and knowledge of different species of corals and what might be affecting them allows us to have a better idea of what's going on. And if we are able to catch the corals when they are being affected by stony coral tissue loss, one of the things that they have been using is an antibiotic paste. So it is believed to be a bacterial infection. Coral diseases are notoriously hard to figure out exactly what they are. Some coral diseases are bacterial and other are viral, and it seems to be very difficult really to figure out what all is going on. But it's believed to be that this is bacterial because it has been thwarted by antibiotic paste. And so primarily in 2022 to 2023, but over the past 5 years or so, they have treated over 25,000 corals in Florida. And so they put this paste on and it is going to stop the movement of that disease in that individual coral. Now you are in water, and so unfortunately, the disease is still able to then be transmitted throughout the water to other corals. So it has been very hard to stop entirely. But unfortunately, partially because it's already affected so many corals and we have so many that have died, there aren't as many vectors for it. And so the disease seems to be calming down a bit in the Florida area. Let's check. And yes, thank you. Kate has been putting some of the links in the chat, and we'll also send a follow-up email later on with some of these links. But if you want to get some more information, there's so many good resources out there, and AGRA is a great one. The other main threat that I wanted to talk about is coral bleaching. So coral bleaching is what happens when corals get stressed out. And usually it is because the temperatures are too warm. They can also get stressed out because of anoxia, which is no oxygen, or hypoxia, low oxygen. But primarily it's happening because they're getting too warm. So remember, corals don't like being cold, but they also don't like being too hot. It's like the Goldilocks zone. And you can also think of yourself, if you're sick, we tend to throw up. You just want to get everything out of your system. And scientists don't still totally understand what's going on with the corals and the zooxanthellae during the bleaching, but it seems like corals kick their zooxanthellae out when they're really stressed. And maybe it's that same type of thing. You're just trying to get everything out of you. But unfortunately, they're throwing out their food source. And again, they don't get all of their food from zooxanthellae, so they still can survive for a while. So if you think about if we ate a granola bar every day, if that's all you were eating, eventually you're going to die, but you are going to survive for a while. And if you're put on a granola bar diet for 2 weeks, you're probably not going to be happy, but you might be okay. And then if your food source comes back, then you're going to be able to come back, right? So that's sort of what's happening with our corals. And we don't know exactly how long they can survive because it depends on the species of coral, it depends on the conditions and how extreme and how warm that water is, how long it stays warm, but also what else is going on in the ecosystem if there's other stressors. But I did want to show These images here of some of the corals during the bleaching event in 2023 in the Virgin Islands, you can see that there was this Orbicella, this star coral, that was healthy, very much bleached, and then thankfully did recover. So corals can recover. If you are bleached, it doesn't necessarily mean you're dead. This image on the left hand, well, sorry, the left hand part of this image, this is another finger coral. You can see that it's bright white, but you can see the polyps. I love this. You can see the little individual tentacles. So this is a coral that is bleached. It no longer has its zooxanthellae. So the zooxanthellae are what's giving it its color. So it's kicked out the zooxanthellae. So it no longer has that colorful algae living in it. So now all you see is the tissue of the coral. And so it is just clear white because you're looking through that clear tissue to the white skeleton made out of calcium carbonate, like our bones. And so this coral is still very much alive. It is bleached, but it is alive. You can still see its tissue. On the right-hand side, however, you can see a finger coral that now looks a little like slimy and it's starting to have some darker color on it. So once that coral has it can't survive on the granola bar diet anymore. It has died. Now those tissues are going to start to slough off. And once that coral is no longer actively like having those tentacles able to clean itself, able to keep algae from growing on it, you guys know you put anything in the water, algae will grow on it within a couple of days. And so if you have corals that are now dead, they're going to start to be covered in algae. So if you're able to get close enough, you can really still tell whether the coral is bleached and alive or whether it is dead. And in 2023, we had the worst bleaching event that we've had in the Florida Keys. You can see here the top image or the top graphic is of the sea surface temperatures in the Florida Keys. These have been recorded since the mid 80s, and you can see the overall trend, and that has been increasing over time. And then 2023, we got way hotter than ever have before, much earlier in the season. We have had bleaching every year in the past, well, now 6 years, but it's usually not taking place until September or at least late August and not happening, yeah, that early and that high of a temperature. So in 2023, when we had this early on heat stress, everyone was very concerned. There was unfortunately quite a bit of coral mortality in the area, and also organizations that were doing restoration work. A lot of people had to go out. They actually took some of the corals that they had in these offshore nurseries and brought them back onto their onshore nurseries where they were able to keep a better eye on them and control the temperatures before they brought them back out. So this is what was going on in 2023. There was actually a hurricane that came through in August, and hurricanes, we of course do not want a hurricane to hit anyone. We don't want it to hit shore, but they do disrupt the water. They bring cooler, deeper water up. And so if you have a hurricane in the area, it can actually bring those water temperatures down. And that's what happened, and it provided a little bit of relief. So it actually did not get quite as bad as we were concerned it would get in September. They had a little bit of a respite, and the worst of it was actually earlier on in the summer. I did also just want to pull up, this is the Copernicus graph of the sea surface temperature. Again, the gray is showing past years. The gray dotted line is the average sea surface temperature. This is now looking at the entire world. So this is not just the Florida Keys, it's the entire world. So we do have some, seasonal differences that might be different here than what we'd have locally here in Florida. But again, looking at the orange line, that is 2023. You can see how hot last summer was, or 2 summers ago, last summer was as well. So in June and July is really where that temperature started to increase. So it wasn't just here in the Florida Keys, it was globally having a much hotter summer last year. And that increased for quite a while. And you can see even in the start of 2024, our temperatures worldwide were much higher than they have been in any of the previous years. And then part of that is just our temperatures increasing over time. And it also was probably exacerbated by having an El Nino global weather pattern that year. We have now transitioned to neutral going into La Nina. And so we are seeing, even though our temperatures are still, again, way above previous years, they at least are declining slightly. But during this 2023-2024 time period, NOAA declared it to be a global bleaching event, and this is the fourth global bleaching event that NOAA has ever, stated. And so again, this was affecting the Florida Keys, but it was also affecting the Great Barrier Reef in Australia and reefs all over the world. So, we've got all of this going on, and I definitely don't want to be just a total Debbie Downer here. So, talking about some of the things that we are doing, I say we, I don't mean myself specifically, but all of the different organizations and people in Florida and really throughout the entire world. What are some of the different things that we are doing in order to try to address these issues and try to help these coral reefs? One of the things that you'll hear about a lot is coral restoration. So, coral restoration, we know that there are places in Florida Keys and in other places around the world where we have lost so many corals that if we don't intervene, there is very little chance that corals are going to end up being back there because you need to have enough of a population somewhere for them to be able to reproduce on their own and be able to bring corals back to that area. So if we have lost all of the corals within a reef, we want to be outplanting some corals so that they are then able to reproduce naturally in the future. And so, in order to do that, we are going to be growing corals in nurseries, whether those nurseries are taking place in tanks on shore or whether they are going to be offshore. So, that image on the right-hand side is of a piece of a staghorn coral that is attached to PVC, and we make these PVC trees that are offshore, and that is where those corals are able to grow. Scientists have learned that if we fragment corals into smaller pieces, they actually grow more rapidly. Think about, if you get injured, you tend to, your skin cells are able to grow so quickly in order to try to make that back up, right? So we think it's something similar going on with the corals. If we fragment them to smaller pieces, they're able to grow more rapidly. And so we are able to help this process. Again, corals tend to grow very slowly. We're able to control the situation a little bit, get corals to grow more rapidly than they would do on their own, and then able to outplant those. On the left-hand side, there is a very tiny elkhorn coral that was outplanted. This is one that was grown on a concrete puck in a tank on shore, and then it was brought out and used with a special type of epoxy cement attached to an area of what used to be a coral that is now just that calcium carbonate limestone attached there. And you can see between 2020 and 2023 how much that elkhorn coral has grown. Now you can see that elkhorn shape that it's got there. So there are a lot of different methods. This can be an entire presentation in its own about the different methods for coral restoration, but that's a lot of what's going on is helping these corals grow more rapidly and outplanting them out. And also, as part of this, I've heard some scientists use the word supercorals and others say they don't like that term. But basically, what we're talking about is the fact that corals that have survived a coral bleaching event or who have survived a disease event, those are going to be corals that are well adapted for the conditions that exist out there now, right? Those are corals that are maybe have some genetics that are allowing them to survive at warmer temperatures or in poor water quality conditions. And so those are the corals then that we want to continue to reproduce, or in some cases, they are even collecting eggs and sperm and making baby corals in some of the research labs. Another thing is that they are collecting these corals so they have gene banks. When we had the stony coral tissue loss disease come through, it pretty much removed all of the corals of certain species, especially one called pillar coral, from the area. And so if they hadn't gone and taken some of those corals and brought them onto the land-based tanks, and there's a whole system of aquaria that are, I'll show you in a minute some of the stats on this, that are part of this network. We would have lost all of the genetics for those species of coral in the Florida Keys entirely. So part of it is also having these gene banks of corals, then they can also do, help with reproduction and maybe do fragmentation, things like that, to be able to outplant back onto the reef. But the other thing is, has the cause of the decline been addressed? And we also realize that it's not just restoration, it's also doing mitigation and entire ecosystem restoration, looking at the causes of decline, whether that is water quality locally or knowing that, our climate change effects of the temperature is one of the big ones. And so it is a multifaceted thing, right? We need to be doing restoration, but we also need to be tackling the larger problem as well. And there is the website, Florida's Coral Reef Resilience Program, which I'm sure that Kate's getting the link in the chat for you there if it hasn't already been. This is a conglomerate of all of these different organizations. So there's a lot of coral restoration organizations, Coral Restoration Foundation, Moat Marine Lab, Florida Aquarium, Reef Renewal, iCare, research organizations that also have programs, so Nova Southeastern, University of Miami, and then also our organizations, our state and federal organizations like our NOAA Fisheries, Florida Fish and Wildlife, Florida Department of Environmental Protection. There are people in all of these different organizations that, some of them are doing similar things. Other times they're partnering because each organization might have a different strength in terms of what they're bringing to the table. But there is a lot of partnership going on, and some of the projects that are happening, these are large scale. And so there's a lot of work being done together. And also, we're still learning a lot. This is science that's really only been going on for the past, like decade or two. And so there's still so much that is being learned. This is the coral monitoring dashboard showing the coral rescue. So this is showing all the different locations where they have taken corals because they were concerned about those corals, especially being affected by stony coral tissue loss or maybe coral bleaching, and they've brought them in. And there are many different facilities that are housing these corals around the entire United States, actually. But I want to throw this on here because you can see the Florida Aquarium and Florida Coral Rescue Center are two of the main places that are housing a lot of these corals. So again, these are going to be grown and protected and used for genetics for hopefully outplanting onto the reefs again in the future. Another big project that is a network, lots of different organizations working together is Mission Iconic Reefs. And this is with NOAA and the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation, with again, quite a few of these different restoration project partners. And their goal is to do a 3 million square foot restoration across 7 different reefs within the Florida Keys. And so this involves coral reefs, but it also involves other parts of the ecosystem, such as diadema, which are a species, the black spine sea urchin, long spine sea urchin, because they know that that is an important species for feeding on algae on the reefs, and that's an important part as well. So again, there's a lot of different researchers, restoration organizations, and state and federal partners who are all working on that project. So if we do not work for one of those organizations, what are things that the rest of us can do to try to contribute to, the restoration and the health of our coral reefs? If you have the opportunity to snorkel on a reef, whether it's something you get to do on a regular basis or if you are going on vacation somewhere, one thing is to wear a rash guard or sun protection. That doesn't involve sunscreen if you can, or if you are wearing sunscreen, making sure that you choose a reef-safe sunscreen so we're not bringing additional chemicals that will stress out the corals. And your basic safe bet is to look for something that says it has non-nano zinc. We're trying to definitely avoid the oxybenzone and oxynoctate, those chemicals. Obviously, we want to make sure that we are not touching corals, not standing on them, not kicking on them, and also just being aware of fins because they make us have longer legs than we're used to, and making sure that we're not kicking them or stirring up sediment that could then land on top of the corals. And if you have a boat, most places in the Florida Keys, if you're going out, there's going to be mooring buoys where we attach our lines to so that we're not putting anchors down, but always making sure that we're not anchoring near or on top of the reef. If you dive or are leading tours out on reefs, there are a lot of great ways that you can get involved doing citizen science, reporting what you see. So one thing is you can become a bleach watch observer, and there is a training online that you can do to become a bleach watch observer. That is specifically within Florida. We've got a link that will share that. Also, AGRA has a ton of different trainings and different metrics that they survey for, including bleaching, disease, fish, urchins. So those are all different surveys you can get involved with. And then again, reporting invasive species, and that's with the website that we'll throw in there, USGS, being on the lookout for that soft coral. And then whether you live near a coral, whether you live in another area of the state, honestly, what affects corals also affects most marine habitats. So whether you're trying to protect corals, you're trying to protect seagrass beds, you're trying to protect whatever your local environment is, one of the things is trying to reduce our nutrient input. So in our yard, we can do that through Florida-friendly landscaping principles, following fertilizers or ordinances, and trying to reduce the amount of stormwater runoff that goes from our properties into the water. So trying to have proper stormwater management, and also supporting any septic to sewer conversion programs that are on in the area. And the Florida Keys actually had a huge septic to sewer conversion program that happened around 2017. It was if you can imagine all of those homes that are on the Keys, if they all have septic systems, all of those nutrients are leaching directly into that area near the coral reefs, contributing greatly to the nutrients and the algae problems that they have in the area. So that was a big win, getting so much of the area onto a sewer system where it's able to be treated for nutrients. And of course, protecting our wetlands and our coastal habitats. And continuing on, just being good environmental stewards. Um, you know, Unfortunately, it is a big one. It's a hard one to tackle, but with increasing temperatures and climate change being one of the major factors affecting corals through coral bleaching, trying to reduce our consumption and our carbon emissions, and supporting policies and policymakers and regulations that are going to be promoting reducing of carbon emissions and environmental conservation is definitely vital. And then other smaller things we can do, especially if you're right in the areas, making sure that we're disposing of our trash and our fishing gear properly and making those sustainable choices in terms of what we are using so that we aren't contributing to this problem locally. And so with that, I think Kate's been throwing all the links in the chat, but we'll also send an email to you all tomorrow with the links for all these different great resources. There's so much out there if there's anything you want to learn more about. And also, I did just want to give a plug that one of the Florida Master Naturalist Program courses is marine habitat restoration. We talk about coral reefs, we talk about sponges, and we talk about artificial reefs and seagrasses. And I co-teach part of that class, and we will be having, I believe, two different sections of that course, one in May and one in either June or July. So that's something to look out for as well if that is something you're interested in learning more about. So with that, thank you guys. I know I talked a lot, but I hope that you all enjoyed that and learned quite a bit. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions in the future. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you all for any questions that we have.